Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anash, and I am a developer programs engineer with the Google Ads engineering team. So today's talk is about using the client libraries. So we'll cover the following topics. We'll start with an introduction about the client libraries. We'll go over why you should use client libraries or why we think the client library should be the preferred way of using the APIs. Then we'll see some point about migrating from the AdWords API client libraries. Then I'll share some resources. We have some time towards the end for the Q&A, but in case you have more questions, the code labs follows. So, all of us will be around as well. So some of these questions you might want to, wait until the code labs come so that you can try out things and then ask more questions. Okay, so how many of you use the client libraries? The old API, new API? All right. All right, so that makes things much easier for me. All right, so the client libraries are the preferred way of using the Google Ads API. There are three broad reasons why we recommend the client libraries over making the calls by hand. The first one is easy configuration. So if you're working with the API, we saw in the morning, there are a lot of things other than just making the API call. So you have to do the configuration, you have to do authentication and refresh tokens. You have to be aware about server outages or like timeouts and things like that, and retry mechanisms in place. You have to do logging to troubleshoot issues. All these things are handled by the client library and provide us functionality to you so that you can focus on building your application. The second thing is that the client libraries provide an object-based API. So you don't have to build the requests by hand. You don't have to worry about HTTP headers and things like that. You can just use objects and services and then just make the API calls. The third thing is code examples. We provide ready-to-use code examples in 5 different programming languages. So you can use that as reference points to start writing your application. So client libraries come in 5 different languages. We have Java, Python, .NET, PHP, and Ruby. So if you compare it against the old SOAP libraries, the one language is missing is Perl. So if you are using that language or you have preferences for other programming languages, talk to me during the code lab and I can see, take your feedback and go back to the team and see what can be done. And the client libraries are primarily distributed through the corresponding dependency management system. So we have Java within Maven, .NET in NuGet, Ruby gems, and so on. So this is where you get the compiled package distribution. But in case you want to get the actual code, prefer compiling it yourself, then we are on GitHub. Our repositories are all under github.com/Google Ads. Each of the repositories are named similarly, so it's Google Ads the language name, like Google Ads Java, Google Ads Ruby, and so on. Right, and you can also contribute. It's a standard open source process. You go to GitHub, make some changes, send us a pull request, and that's pretty much it. And why use client libraries? So if you have seen, the Google Ads API is a gRPC API, but it also exposes a REST endpoint. And everyone's familiar with REST, so why not just use REST? Like, why would you want to use the client libraries? So I wanted to compare the client libraries against the REST endpoints. The first thing is that the REST is fairly straightforward to build in terms of your request and response. Like they are all JSON, so it's easy to construct. So it's very useful for debugging resources like or trying out the API and various things. But that also comes with additional issues like you need to build the OAuth flow yourself, handle the authorization manually, do the refresh tokens, do the access token refreshing as they expire and so on. And you need to handle other things like the network replies and all manually. The client libraries take care of these things for you. The client libraries, on the other hand, like provide you an object-based API, so you can deal with objects instead of raw JSON request. and then they are optimized, and it uses grpc behind the scenes, and it uses protobufs for the serialization. So that means that the payload generally tends to be much smaller as compared to JSON, which gives you a certain amount of performance boost. Then uh, it handles things like authorization automatically. So all you have to do is put in a refresh token, and you don't have to worry about things like the access token expiring. The client libraries will automatically detect these and then refresh it behind the scenes in a transparent manner. Another thing that we have added is that if you use the old API, you would know that when you do a typical GET request, it's paged. So you have to increase the page each time and fetch the next page. So one of the things that we did for the client libraries this time is that we built in support for iterators. So all you have to do is just do a for each or like a for loop, and behind the scenes we will detect and fetch the next page as required. Then we have support for logging. So if you are in the mode in your development mode, then you can look at the logging to see if your requests are going as fine. If you find issues, you can just take the logs and send it to us. They are all like redacted by default for your sensitive information, but make sure you check again before sending. And again, the client libraries are managed by the developer relations team. So with regular releases that align with the API releases. And we also provide code examples, which we try to be in par with whatever is in the SOAP API libraries. So let's look through a code example that uses REST. So many of these topics got covered in the overview session in the morning. So I'll just use this as a refresher. So if you remember, if you want to use the API, the first thing that you need is a Google Cloud project. Once you get the cloud project, you have to go into that, the cloud project, and enable the Google Ads API. Then you have to go to the credentials section and create your own client ID and secret. And then you have to get an authorization code, right? And essentially, when you are doing the authorization code, what you have to do is you have to build an authorization URL that looks something like this: accounts.google.com/002 with all your client ID and client secret. So in this example, we are use the code example from the Python library that basically spews out this URL. But if you are building the whole thing from scratch, you'll have to reconstruct this logic. And then you redirect the user to the browser, or you ask the user to copy paste this URL in the browser, which leads the user to see a dialog like this where they provide permissions for using AdWords account, and at the end of which you get an authorization code, and after which you will have to exchange the authorization code for the access token and refresh token. The code snippet is given here. I'm not going into that in too much details because you have the chance to try it all yourself in the code lab in a few minutes. And then you get the response back again as a JSON. You get an access token. This is what you use for authenticating your codes. And then you have the refresh token. This is what you use to get new access tokens once the old access token expires. And then the next step is actually making an API call. So we are trying to create a campaign budget here. So you would create a JSON file that looks something like this. It's an array of operations, and each operation has a create field to which you would set a campaign budget. And that has the properties like name and amount micros. These are two fields I want to set for my budget. And once I do that, I do a post request because I am creating, so it's a mutate. So I do a post to the service endpoint, which is Google Ads or Google APIs.com campaign budgets, and then campaign budgets mutate. And I pass the file in, and then I get the response back, which is an array of results, and it contains the resource name of the newly created. Now let's consider like what you need to do, like how it differs from what you do even you do it using the client libraries, right? So the first step that you need to do if you're working with the client libraries is of course get the client library from GitHub. or using the dependency management system. Then you would run the authentication code example, which will fetch the refresh token for you. It does the whole OAuth walk, at the end of which it will print out a refresh token. And after that, you just copy paste that into the client library's configuration. So the configuration typically has two sections. So the first is the authentication info. There is developer token. This is what you use to use as a license of sort to make the API calls. Then the client ID and the client secret that you created in your cloud project. And the refresh token is generated by running the authenticate in an application, the code example. Uh, and then there is an additional field over here. This is the login customer ID. Now this represents the top level account that corresponds to the credentials that you provide here in the refresh token. So the if you are not familiar, the login customer ID is the concept that you have in the UI. Like you let's say multiple accounts. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so the login customer ID is the concept where like you have multiple accounts that are associated with the login email. So if you log in through the UI, you get a dialog where you can select like multiple accounts, and that then becomes your root of the account which you are operating. So login customer ID represents that account that you want to operate upon. And then there are configuration. Each client library has its own logging that is specific. You have ways to configure like the logging, either using a configuration file or you can programmatically configure your logging. Typically, logging comes in multiple levels: info, debug, and warning. And we provide two kind of logs. We have a detailed log that shows the actual request that went to the server, came back from the response that came back from the server, exceptions that got thrown. That has enough details to help you troubleshoot, but that also means that that log is big. It's not recommended to enable that in production because the amount of log that it writes. There is also a summary log that you can turn on in a production that just gives you the call that was made, which customer ID it was made against, whether the call was success or not. And the logging is written in like a human readable format. It's JSON or similar format that we use for reading purposes, even though the actual wire format is protobuf, which is binary in nature. So a typical log looks something like this. So we have the request and we log the method, which says like where are we making the call to, the host, the set of headers that we are sending. So you can see that some of the keys like developer token are sensitive information, so we redact it by default. And then what gets sent out as a request, you have the customer ID, the query, the page size, and the response that comes back as well. And now let's see how we use the client library to write a code example. So we are going to use the same code example here. So if you go through the client libraries, you have the code examples available just like the way you had them in the AdWords API SOAP libraries, right? So you have examples under which you have multiple folders that shows the general kind of functionalities that is available. And if you dig through into each of the folders, you have the same set of code examples. So one thing that we are trying to do here is that we try to keep the code examples pretty much the same between the old ones and the new ones. So when you want to migrate, there's like always a reference point to say like, let me go at the code examples of the old API, the new API, compare them and see how do I do the same kind of task in both places. So let's go over the creating the budget, the same example that we saw in REST. So the first step is to get hold of a service. So you have a Google Ads client object, and you do a get service, and you provide the service name that you want. So the client library provides a service called campaign budget service, which will return an object of campaign budget service. And then you can create the actual objects. So you can see we are creating an operation here. And once you create the operation, and then you're setting the create field to a campaign budget object, and then you're setting its properties like name and value. So you can see that we are using like an object based approach here instead of building a raw JSON from by scratch. And then you make the API call, which is campaign budget service dot mutate campaign budgets, and you pass the operation along with the customer ID, and you get a response back. So one thing to keep here in mind is that if you use the old APIs, you would know that there is only like a mutate method and a get method, right? And you're supposed to build a request with all the set of parameters in single go. So in the client libraries, we also provide flattened methods, so that when a parameter is required, we try to generate a method overload so that you know what parameters are required here. But that doesn't prevent you from using the default method, which is just create a campaign budget request with the operations and the customer ID in it, or you can just call the customer ID and the operations overloaded method. So with that, I want to cover a few points about migrating from the old the AdWords API client libraries. So it's a comparison between the SOAP libraries. So the first thing is that the SOAP libraries naturally use SOAP as a protocol. So it has SOAP XML going over HTTP1. Then this one instead uses gRPC, which uses protocol buffers, which leads to a smaller payload. And the traffic actually happens over HTTP2 because that's what gRPC uses. The second thing is that the code tends to be simpler. There are two reasons why this happens. The first thing is that when we built the new API, we simplified several use cases in it, so that you end up writing lesser amount of code with the new API. Right? The second thing that is that we added some additional functionality to the client libraries. For instance, we added support for iterators for paging. So you don't have to write code to page through each and everything. Like, you just write a for each loop, and a lot of boilerplate code is taken care of for you. So this leads to like a smaller amount of code that you can write. Like for instance, we see that our code examples in the Java library are generally around 25% smaller in terms of the lines of code that we write. And the last thing is that the client libraries are compatible with each other, which essentially means that whenever possible, we try to keep the same kind of paradigm across both places. The libraries have been tested to coexist in the same project. So you can just take like one project, add reference to the old API library and the new API library, and then you can just migrate like part of your code at a time. And we also tried a few library improvements. You can see the whole list here. But in general, like for languages like Python and Ruby, the old API used to provide like hashes or dictionaries to work with. Now we have actual objects, so that improves the experience. We also try to be on the latest runtime wherever possible. So PHP, for instance, PHP 7, Java has support for Java 9 plus, and so on. And the next point is the code example parity. So we don't have 100% code example parity so far. We have been trying to strike a balance between the new set of features that we introduced, like we have code examples for billing, hotel ads, planning, recommendations. These are the new features that users have been asking us. So when we made these features available, we also made sure that the examples are available for these new features. The next thing that we have been prioritizing is we have been trying to get code examples out for the most commonly used features. So if you go into the basic operations and campaign management, you'll see that all those things like almost 100% code example parity. If you go into something like less used, like media service or miscellaneous items, you'll see that those aren't there yet. But we are trying to add more code examples. So in the next couple of months, you will see that there are way more code examples coming your way. So to summarize, we support 5 different languages today. We prefer that you use client libraries over REST for various reasons, like easier authentication, speed of making API call, and a better support. Use REST when you want to learn about the API, debugging the API, or in cases where you want to use a language that we don't support and we can't support, then definitely use REST as a fallback mechanism. And here are some resources. We have all the repositories for the client libraries. We have the migration guide, API reference, the code examples, which you again get from the repositories as well. The release notes, so you can keep track of what services come online, and then the Google Ads query language.